At Davos, Prime Minister Mark Carney reiterated Canada's support for Greenland and Denmark, and for Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty.
Our commitment to NATO's Article 5 is unwavering.
But he also acknowledged something else.
I think clearly NATO is experiencing a test right now.
Is this the most critical test the alliance has faced since it was established almost 80 years ago? And how have Trump's threats affected the future of security in the Arctic? I asked Roland Paris, director of the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa, Stephanie Carvin, an associate professor of international relations at Carleton University's Norman Paterson School of International Affairs, and Robert Fife, the Globe and Mail's Ottawa bureau chief. Great to have you all three on the program. I want to start with you, Robert. As we mentioned, President Trump announced last week that he and NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte had reached a quote-unquote framework for a future deal. A lot of questions as to what that deal actually encompasses. Can you help us understand a little bit? What do we know about it?
Well, it's the same deal we've already had with Greenland, which is that Denmark and Greenland remain part of NATO. They remain independent. The Americans are not going to buy or take over Greenland, but you will probably see more U.S. investment on base they already have there. And more significantly, I think it's going to be part of a continental defense missile shield, which Canada is going to participate in as well. So it was a lot of bluster. It shook up the NATO alliance. It shook up Europe. It shook up Canada. As he always does, he's a wrecking ball whenever he turns his attention to any issue. But at the end of the day, fortunately, the European members of NATO, as well as Canada, stood up to the bully, and he backed down. That's not to say that there isn't a necessity to increase security in the Arctic because the ice is melting, and Russia's got very sophisticated bases there. China is now beginning to use the Northwest Passage as well. So there is a real need for NATO to be able to beef up its security in the Arctic, including in Greenland, and all countries, I think, are in the NATO alliance are going to do that. But it won't be an American, we're the only ones that are going to take over Greenland. That approach has failed, and the president has moved on to other targets and tantrums that he will be, as usual, doing almost every day, to the consternation of the world.
Well, Roland, I want to bring you in here talking about Trump. Why do you think Trump's mission changed when he landed in Europe? A bit of a departure from what we thought we were going to get, but why did it change?
Well, I don't think his mission has changed. I think that he adjusted his tactics, and my guess is because he learned and he saw that there was actual resistance, real resistance building to his pressure on Greenland. And I say his mission hasn't changed because I don't think he's going to give up his attempts to secure Greenland. There's a parallel here to what's happened with the role of ICE in Minneapolis. So you have a kind of a horrendous killing of somebody on the street in Minneapolis. Suddenly there is a shift in the discussion about ICE in the United States. Some of Trump's closest allies start expressing their concerns. He hits a point where he is facing real resistance, and he adjusts. He changes his language. He changes the officials who are going to be responsible. He makes a tactical backstep. I don't think it changes at all what his mission is, and his mission remains the transformation of the United States into much more of an imperial power, using its power to extract concessions, and his treatment of allies as not allies, but as clients, or as subservient countries that are there to be exploited and for their resources to be extracted. That hasn't changed.
Stephanie, Roland mentioned resistance. The president is facing resistance from a number of people, Denmark's prime minister being one, insisting that American sovereignty over military bases in Greenland remains a, quote, red line. Why?
Well, I think in the same way that we Canadians would not want to give up any of our sovereignty to accommodate the wishes of President Trump, Denmark has felt the same way. In fact, I've seen a lot of commentary. There's been a lot of tension between Greenland and Denmark for some time. Greenland, there is an independence movement there. And strangely enough, this has actually brought the two sides together as they have been concerned about their sovereignty. So in the same way that we are would not want to give up, I don't know, Baffin Island or anything like that. I think this is where Denmark is. And there was a lot of resentment, actually, after the discussion between Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, and President Trump by Denmark, who said, look, there's been this announcement. We haven't been consulted, and this is our territory. So I guess, yes, there is this deal, but what I would suggest is, one is obviously Denmark's still concerned and they have an obvious vested interest. Secondly, President Trump, a deal is not a deal to him, right? A deal is just his mood swing. And I think that, a lot of this depends on, his attitude towards various things going on, whether domestically or internationally, really depends on who was the last person in the room with him, right? So I think there's this always competition to get there. And, yes, there was this deal announced, but we did see this weekend, for example, on Truth Social, which is the Trump social media platform, that he was posting pictures of him being in the Arctic with penguins, which is interesting because there are no penguins in the Arctic, right? But there we go. So, I mean, I don't think this is over yet. I still think that there is going to be tension. And to a large extent, we did see some of the concerns by the Secretary General of NATO this week, when he spoke to Parliament, the European Parliament, and basically expressed that, look, we have to keep the United States in NATO, and that there is going to have to be some kind of deal arranged over Greenland. So I just don't think this is over yet. And I think this is going to be something that really does continue to dominate 2026.
All right, I want to play a short snippet of Mark Carney's speech in Davos. Let's have a listen.
We knew the story of the international rules-based order was partially false, that the strongest would exempt themselves when convenient, that trade rules were enforced asymmetrically. And we knew that international law applied with varying rigor depending on the identity of the accused or the victim. In a world of great power rivalry, the countries in between have a choice: compete with each other for favor, or to combine to create a third path with impact.
As we know, that speech got a rare applause from the crowd there. Robert, I want to know, why do you think Carney decided that this was the stage to sort of break down the international rules-based order?
Well, I mean, you have to look at the participants who go to Davos, not only world leaders, but also very significant members of the business community in Europe and Asia and in the United States. It was a good opportunity because he was speaking to both world leaders, but also corporate leaders in the world. And it was a message that really hit home. I mean, he got a standing ovation for which I think in some ways was almost a Churchillian speech, the way he framed what the United States and to some extent China as well have been using their economic might to be able to bully other countries. And he's quite right that countries like Europe and Canada and Japan and South Korea need to band together to be able to stand up to the United States in the change in its American first policy and its use of tariffs and economic integration to try to bully people. China's doing the same thing. It was a very important message. It really obviously it upset President Trump. He was upstaged by Prime Minister Carney, and he's threatening 100% tariffs, and then last night he's got his Treasury Secretary out saying that Carney called the president and pedaled aggressively back on what he said in Davos, and the Prime Minister on the Tuesday morning came out and said, absolutely not true. I told the president I stand by exactly what I said, and then they went on to talk about the trade stuff. So the Kuzma negotiations that are upcoming. So it hit the mark, and the little tantrum from the president showed that it did hit the mark.
Roland, Prime Minister Carney, as we heard, encouraged the middle powers to rise up. How is Canada meeting that rallying call?
Well, it was an important message. In some ways, a lot of the elements of the speech that he gave in Davos, he's given before, but he brought it together, and the combination of the venue and the timing were I think, helped to explain why it resonated so much. And it resonated in part because this pushback message came at a moment when the Europeans and others were really shocked by Trump's threats about Greenland, and reflecting on a year in which their strategy really had been to placate Trump as much as possible, to accept, very significant concessions in order to, meet Trump's demands, in the hopes that doing so would stabilize the relationship. And then a year in, you have a threat against a NATO country. And so Carney's message about this kind of appeasement being a failed strategy in the long run, I think was really resonated for its audience at the time. The challenge with rallying together middle powers is that each country also has the imperative to try and manage its relations with the United States, and the incentives to do so separately will be very strong, especially if Trump continues his divide and conquer strategies and tries to offer, special deals, which is precisely the path that Britain took, for example. It ended up with a 10% tariff instead of the EU's 15% tariff, but they're all further behind than before.
Stephanie, I'll get your take on this as well. Robert had mentioned the 100% tariff in Canada. The question is a bit of a hard one to ask you. What game is Trump playing here?
Again, I don't know if it's a game. I mean, we keep hearing this talk of the Don Roe doctrine. I keep calling it the Darth Vader doctrine because, he keeps saying, I've changed the deal, pray I don't change it further. So even when countries make deals, Trump is willing to tear it up right away, proving that, these are not even worth the crayons and napkins that they're written with and on. And, just getting back to Greenland, of course, yes, the UK immediately kind of arranged this deal for 10% tariff deal, but Trump was threatening a huge tariff on the UK again over Greenland because, the UK has been supporting Greenland. So even, I think this is the thing we have to realize about the Trump era, is that even if you have a deal, you don't have a deal. It's going to be torn up very quickly, depending on a very mercurial, to put it politely, president's mood. And then secondly, that these will always be subject to some kind of revision, that these, promises made are not necessarily going to be promises kept. So I think this is a big part of this. And I think this is what Carney was speaking to. But I mean, it's interesting because I think in some ways Carney's speech has become somewhat of a Rorschach test, an ink blot test, like in terms of how it's being taken here in Canada. I've seen a lot of people say, oh, this is a huge, broadside against the United States. Yes, but I think, to the points made by, I think, both Roland and Robert, it's also about China. It's also about other states. And the problem, I think, that Roland identified is that the U.S. is really good at, kind of putting pressure on one ally at a time and trying to force those concessions. And I think, Carney, to be fair, when he's talking about whether it's the United States, whether it's China, whether it's Russia, other countries, we do have to continue to band together. And if anything, I didn't see it necessarily as a broad stroke against Trump. I actually saw it almost more as a broad stroke against the Prime Minister of the UK, Starmer. It's a broad stroke against Starmerism, which is kind of consistent US appeasement to try and get the best deal you can in the moment, even if that deal may be torn up in the coming days or weeks or months.
Robert, I want to talk a little bit about Canada's defense. Is Canada prepared to defend its sovereignty in the North as it is right now?
Well, it says it is, but we're way, way behind in terms of our defense spending. We're boosting it significantly, but this takes time, and it takes time to be able to buy the equipment, both icebreakers and aircraft and missiles and all that other radar systems and all the things that are going to be needed to boost our presence in the Arctic, but also just overall to increase the ability of the armed forces to be able to be much more resilient than it has been over the last 40 years or so. So the Prime Minister is pretty dedicated to trying to significantly increase defense spending that in a way that will also increase jobs and high-tech jobs in this country, both blue-collar and high-tech jobs in this country. But all of this is going to take time. You simply can't just buy something off the shelf very easily in the defense industry. But and I think one thing we do probably have to credit Trump for is that he's pushed Europe and Canada and Japan and South Korea and countries around the world who have been part of the U.S. alliance to increase their defense spending because the United States is not as reliable a partner as it was.
Stephanie, I do want to get you in very quickly because last time we spoke, we were talking about the Canadian Armed Forces not having enough ammunition to do military drills. So it clearly, you know, as Robert had mentioned, this is long term. This will take some time. But who do we look to now?
In terms of
sovereignty in the Arctic and defending us.
Well, I think to be fair to NATO and NATO countries, they have been concerned with the Arctic prior to the second Trump administration, right? When I've had the opportunity to travel to Europe and European countries, there's a lot more interest in the Arctic, and so NATO has been looking at this issue for some time, and I think that there are a lot of pre-existing relations that we can build on. In particular, Canada has been doing a lot of work with the Nordic countries, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, especially now that Sweden is in NATO. And so there's a lot of relationships we can build there on. The uncomfortable reality is the US is also there, right? We are going to have to find a way to work with them. We cannot ignore them. And I also don't necessarily think that we should. So we are going to have to accommodate this in some way. There may be some grounds to do this if, you know, there is this interest in the Arctic to work with the Trump administration. I just think the challenge is, you know, as I've been saying, Trump's unpredictable. He makes that kind of cooperation hard. So we really do need to have, you know, perhaps this, you know, overall NATO approach to the Arctic. But at the same time, I hope sincerely that we're all coming up with a plan B.
Roland, as we know, we have the framework here, but it's still unclear where the fight over Greenland is going to be heading next, unless you do know. But help us understand a little bit, you know, will NATO survive this? There's some serious questions about sort of where this alliance moves after all of this, but what are your thoughts?
You know, it is hard to know at this point. I don't think there's going to be a moment when, you know, there's a declaration, NATO is over. NATO can exist on paper, and the trust that it actually relies upon can be gone. And that's the thing about military alliances. What makes them effective is an idea, a set of ideas, a belief that all of the members will come to each other's defense if any of them is attacked. And, you know, it was one thing for Trump to raise doubts about whether he would come to the support of NATO countries if they were attacked. I think he was asked specifically about Poland, and he said it would depend on the circumstances. A very different thing for him to threaten military force against another NATO member. And that obviously weakens the trust, but it also weakens the deterrent effect of NATO as an organization, because if there are doubts by an adversary about whether NATO would respond to an attack on any one of its members, then it potentially invites them to test whether that resolve still exists. And so looking a few years down the line, if the war in Ukraine comes to at least temporary conclusion, Russia has an opportunity to rebuild its forces and look elsewhere. I would be very concerned about the Baltic countries going forward, and I think it would be very important for NATO to be able to communicate that it continues to be an alliance based on resolve and trust among its members, and we'll see whether that's possible beyond Trump.
Robert, what does this say about the future of the alliance, and hopefully pick up on what Roland said there?
Well, look, I mean, there is a pretty widespread support in the U.S. Congress for NATO. They understand the importance of this alliance to the United States. The United States can't go it alone. I mean, they are obviously the world's biggest military power, but alliances and allies are absolutely important in the global sphere. And I think there is a realization in Congress of that. Certainly, there's a realization of that in the U.S. military, and I think broad sections of American society. But there is an element in the Republican Party led by Trump and the MAGA crowd that are opposed to that. And this is something that even if Trump, if we manage to get rid of him in the next election campaign and say the Democrats win, this is still going to be a problem that the U.S. is going to be grappling with, and NATO is going to be grappling with for some time, because President Trump has done an enormous amount of damage to the NATO alliance and undermined confidence in the institutions. And even if he goes away or drops dead tomorrow, that there is a segment of American society that do not want to go it alone, and that is going to be a challenge for NATO in the foreseeable future.
Stephanie, you get the last 30 seconds.
Yeah, it's always boring to have the radical agreement with the other speakers, but it is true. I mean, there is the concern about a zombie NATO, right? But at the same time, I think, like I'll try to put the silver lining on this, which is that the United States has something like 80,000 troops in Europe right now in several military bases. Those bases are used for American operations worldwide, right? And the U.S. clearly is very randomly under the Trump administration getting itself involved in a lot of conflicts worldwide, and it will need to continue to have those military bases. So I don't necessarily think that a withdrawal is necessary, but to Robert's good point, J.D. Vance last year gave a very serious speech at the Munich Security Conference where he's basically like, Europe, you're dead. You're kind of dead to us, and we're moving on. And between that and the U.S. national security strategy, even if the U.S. continues to have a presence in Europe and NATO, we are still going to be in a rough ride for the next 3 years, at least.
All right, well, we are going to leave it there. Roland, Robert, Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us on the program. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.